There's something we never quite talk about when we talk about the modern right. We talk about the slogans. We talk about the candidates. We talk about the culture wars. But we rarely talk about the underlying engine driving it all. And that's strange because the engine's staring us in the face. For more than 40 years, really since Reagan, the right has built its identity around three pillars: freedom, small government, and rugged individualism. These ideas were sold as an antidote to a supposedly intrusive state. The bureaucratic overreach that conservatives claimed was choking American ingenuity. It was a powerful narrative, simple enough to fit on a bumper sticker, and sweeping enough to animate a movement. But here's the thing. When you stop and look at the rhetoric, and actually look at the policy outcomes, something doesn't add up. The promise of freedom has steadily morphed into expanded surveillance, more policing, more restrictions on personal autonomy, and an erosion of privacy. Small government has somehow translated into a government that is deeply involved in regulating bodies, identities, and private choices. Just not in regulating corporations or, guns. And rugged individualism has been selectively applied, praised only when it supports deregulation, never when it challenges entrenched power. But if you take the slogans at face value, you get one story. If you take the actions at face value, you get another. Put those two stories together, and a picture starts to emerge. The modern right has not been shrinking the state. It's been repurposing it. The state becomes smaller only in areas that inconvenience the wealthy. It becomes larger, more coercive, and more punitive in the areas that control everyone else. And that's why I don't see the last 40 years as ideological drift or confusion. I see it as a project. Most people talk about the rise of authoritarianism on the right as if it's spontaneous, as if it comes from populist anger, cultural resentment, or a few charismatic leaders. But when you trace the money, the messaging networks, the think tanks, the judicial appointments, the lobbying apparatus, and the political patronage, a more coherent story emerges. The authoritarian turn isn't an accident. It's an investment. Think tanks didn't multiply by coincidence. They were funded, deliberately, strategically, by a small circle of billionaire families who understood that controlling the narrative is half the battle. The assault on labor wasn't a philosophical debate. It was a calculated move to disable the one counterweight to corporate power. The obsessive culture wars weren't organic. They were engineered to keep the public focused on symbolic battles, while the real redistribution of power happened quietly in boardrooms and legislative back channels. When you see the pattern, you realize something. Authoritarianism doesn't have to come from a dictator. It can come from an economic elite that uses the state as an instrument, an elite that prefers order over democracy, predictability over equality, and compliance over empowerment. It's an authoritarianism that wears a suit, not a uniform. It doesn't march, it lobbies. It doesn't overthrow the government, it buys it. And here's where it gets really interesting. Once you understand this dynamic, you start to see echoes in unexpected places. In the stories we've told ourselves for over a century about where power might go when democracy becomes fragile. Jack London saw it before most people did, imagining an oligarchy that rises not through charisma, but through capital. Robert Heinlein projected it into the future, where corporations become sovereign entities, eclipsing governments entirely. Two writers, two worlds, 70-year gap between them. And yet, both chart the same trajectory. A society where wealth quietly supplants citizenship, and where the machinery of the state becomes an administrative arm of the economic ruling class. That's the blind spot we keep ignoring. We look for dictators. We look for coups. We look for strongmen with armbands and flags. But the version of authoritarianism that's been growing in the United States doesn't need any of that. It's quieter. It's cleaner. It's more legal. And it's been unfolding in slow motion right in front of us, wrapped in the language of freedom that makes most people feel like they're choosing it. And that's why the parallels with London and Heinlein matter. They show us that this isn't new, it isn't accidental, and it isn't going away on its own. It is, in many ways, the political mutation we were warned about, a system where the facade of democracy remains intact, while the substance of democracy erodes beneath it. If we don't acknowledge that blind spot now, we won't understand anything that comes next. If we're going to talk about the authoritarian drift in modern politics, we have to talk about Jack London, again. And it's almost funny because most people know London for Call of the Wild or White Fang. Not for the book that might be his most important and, ironically, most overlooked political prediction, The Iron Heel, published in 1908. The Iron Heel is usually described as one of the earliest dystopian novels. But calling it a dystopia almost undersells what London was doing. He wasn't imagining some far-off future with ray guns and totalitarian robots. He was looking directly at the industrial America of his day and asking a very simple question. What happens if the wealthy keep winning every political battle? What happens if the concentration of economic power isn't checked? What happens if capitalism runs out of counterweights? And his answer is chillingly familiar. London didn't imagine a dramatic coup or a dictator sweeping in to overthrow the Constitution. In his world, democracy doesn't die because someone tears it up. It dies because it becomes irrelevant. People still vote, Congress still meets, the courts still issue rulings, journalists still publish columns. But all of these institutions slowly lose the one thing that gives them meaning: independence. They're not abolished, they're absorbed. That's the essence of the Iron Heel. The idea that once a wealthy elite becomes powerful enough, it doesn't need to destroy democratic institutions. It simply bends them until they serve its interests. And once that bending reaches a certain point, the institutions become props in a kind of political theater. This is what makes London's insight so uncomfortable. He shows how authoritarianism can flourish without a dictator. You don't need a Mussolini. You just need a class of people so rich, so interconnected, and so entrenched that they can substitute their preferences for the public's. Wealth becomes policy. Policy becomes power. Power becomes stability. The Iron Heel isn't a person, it's a system. What London captures better than almost anyone of his time is the structural nature of this kind of authoritarianism. It's not loud and it's not flamboyant. It's not even particularly ideological. It's managerial, almost corporate in its logic. Why waste time persuading the public when you can shape the environment the public lives in? Why silence the press when you can buy the press? Why crush dissent outright when you can keep people fighting amongst themselves over everything except the one thing that matters? And here's the part that feels most prophetic. London understood that the middle class itself would become the stabilizing force for the oligarchy, not out of devotion, out of desperation. If your job, your mortgage, your retirement, your health care, your social standing are tied to the system, you'll support it, even if it doesn't support you. Especially if the alternative feels chaotic or frightening. Authoritarianism, in London's model, doesn't rely on the fear of the ruler. It relies on the fear of falling. And when he describes workers turning against each other and professionals defending policies that objectively make their lives harder, and political parties acting as delivery mechanisms for corporate priorities, it all sounds so contemporary that you have to remind yourself he was writing before the First World War. This is why The Iron Heel is more than a novel. It's a theory of power. London saw that the merger of wealth and government would transform democracy into something like a constitutional puppet show. Institutions still moving, still gesturing, still speaking, but animated by different hands. And when I look at American politics over the last 40 years, the privatization wave, the lobbying explosion, the financialization of everything, the weakening of unions, the rise of billionaire-funded think tanks and media empires, it's hard not to see London's fingerprints all over the timeline. We didn't get a dictator, not yet. We didn't get jackbooted thugs marching through Washington. They're marching through Minneapolis and Portland. We got something subtler, the slow normalization of private power overriding public will. London wrote it as a warning. A century later, it reads as a roadmap. If Jack London gave us the blueprint, the 1980s gave us the construction phase. This is where the story stops being theoretical and becomes something you can trace in policy decisions, corporate strategies, and political rhetoric. The Reagan-era isn't just a chapter in American politics. It's the pivot point where the country changes course, where the long capture of the state by private wealth begins to accelerate. When Reagan stepped onto the national stage, he brought with him a very simple promise: get government off people's back. It was a compelling line. Americans were frustrated with inflation, with bureaucracy, with a sense that the country had lost its momentum. Reagan presented himself as the antidote: freedom through deregulation, prosperity through tax cuts, strength through national pride. It felt like clarity after a long stretch of confusion. But here's where we have to slow down and ask the uncomfortable questions. Deregulation for whom? Tax cuts for whom? Freedom for whom? When you peel back the patriotic glow of the 1980s and look at the structural consequences, the beneficiaries weren't everyday Americans who believed in Reagan's message. The real winners were corporations and the ultra-wealthy, the emerging oligarchic class that had already begun building its influence in the preceding decades. Consider what happened almost immediately. Financial markets were unleashed. Rules that kept banks, insurers, and investment firms in check were dismantled, allowing speculative capital to balloon beyond anything the New Deal architects could have imagined. Unions were gutted. Reagan's firing of the PATCO workers sent an unmistakable signal. Labor could be crushed with impunity. That single event marked the beginning of a long decline in worker power. Antitrust enforcement essentially died. For nearly a century, preventing monopolies was understood as essential to both economic health and democratic resilience. Under Reagan, that philosophy was replaced with a new doctrine: if it lowers prices, it's fine. Corporations took the hint. Taxes on the wealthy plummeted. Not trimmed, plummeted. Capital gains, corporate taxes, estate taxes, all chipped away, shifting wealth upward at a rate the country hadn't seen since the robber barons. And once wealth concentrates at that scale, something very predictable happens. It becomes political power. Not the kind of power you see in coups or marches or public spectacles. A quieter kind, a procedural kind. The kind exercised through policy levers most people never see. This is the part of the story Americans never learned, because it wasn't sold as political transformation. It was sold as modernization. Lobbying didn't just grow, it exploded, becoming a permanent fixture of the political process. Corporations built entire divisions dedicated to shaping legislation. Billionaires didn't just donate. They created entire ecosystems of influence. Think tanks, media outlets, academic centers, conferences, legal advocacy networks, all designed to produce a steady stream of common sense arguments for policies that would benefit them. And here's the brilliance of it. None of this required dismantling democracy. They didn't need to abolish elections. They needed to shape what elections were about. They needed to dictate what counted as serious policy, what counted as responsible governance, and what counted as radical. They needed to redefine the boundaries of acceptable debate so that the wealthiest always remained inside the circle of protection, no matter which party claimed power. Meanwhile, media consolidation gathered pace. A handful of corporations came to control most of the country's news outlets. Local newspapers were bought up or hollowed out. Cable networks emerged with clear ideological missions. Suddenly, the national narrative, the framing of events, the sense of what mattered, could be shaped by a remarkably small cohort of donors, executives, and owners. This wasn't a dictatorship. It wasn't a strongman seizing power. It was something harder to see and therefore harder to resist. A structural capture of the state by economic elites, carried out through legal mechanisms, institutional reshaping, and the strategic weaponization of rhetoric. In the classic model of authoritarianism, people lose their rights to a central figure, a Mussolini, a Hitler, a Franco. But in the American model that began under Reagan, there was no central figure. There didn't need to be. The system itself became the iron heel. It was distributed, diffuse, polite, wrapped in the language of freedom. Regulations that protected the public were portrayed as chains. Corporate influence was portrayed as expertise. Union power was portrayed as corruption. Tax cuts for billionaires were portrayed as investments in prosperity. The genius of the Reagan pivot wasn't that it dismantled government. It was that it repurposed government. Political institutions were reoriented away from the idea of protecting the common good and toward the idea of facilitating private wealth. What emerged over the next decades was a new kind of political order. Not a dictatorship, not a democracy, but something in between. A managed system where elections still happen, but policy is shaped by the donor class. Where political identity revolves around culture wars, not material conditions. Where freedom is invoked constantly, but rarely practiced in any meaningful way. This is the long capture. This is how the iron heel of wealth wrapped itself around the American state. Slowly, subtly, and under the banner of liberty. One of the things Jack London understood about authoritarianism, what makes the iron heel so unnervingly relevant, is that brute force alone is never enough. History shows us that fear, coercion, and violence have their limits. People push back, revolts happen, governments collapse. The truly effective form of control is subtler. It works by directing attention, by shaping perception, by keeping people busy fighting battles that don't threaten the foundation of power. In short, authoritarianism thrives on distraction. This is where the modern right, particularly since the Reagan-era, perfected a technique London could only have imagined. The weaponization of the culture war became a tool, an instrument of political technology. Instead of focusing on structural inequality or the concentration of wealth, the focus shifted to identity, race, religion, sexuality, gender, immigration. These became the battlegrounds, the arenas where outrage could be generated, amplified, and channeled. Emotional energy that might otherwise have gone into collective action or labor solidarity instead flows towards symbolic skirmishes that leave the underlying hierarchy untouched. Think about it. When debates about curriculum, bathrooms, drag performances, or pronouns dominate the news cycle, whose interests are actually being served? On the surface, it looks like people are exercising democracy. But in practice, these fights absorb attention, divide communities, and manufacture loyalty along cultural lines rather than economic ones. Millions of hours of social energy, public commentary, and emotional investment are expended on issues that are largely tangential to who actually benefits financially or politically. Meanwhile, the billionaire class, the architects of this system, sit largely invisible. They write legislation, fund candidates, shape lobbying campaigns, and consolidate wealth without needing to engage directly in public culture wars. While the public fights over symbols, the structural levers of power quietly shift in favor of private interests. Policy continues to accumulate in their favor. Labor protections erode. Unions are weakened. Media consolidates, and economic mobility declines. The culture war is the smoke. The wealth and power grab is the fire. This isn't accidental. This isn't a side effect of democracy or media. It's a mechanism shift. London's Iron Heel relied on structural control, yes, but it also relied on division. Divide and rule isn't just a slogan, it's a principle. Keep people focused on each other. Keep them outraged. Keep them emotional. Keep them powerless. Let them believe they're acting politically, while the system funnels their energy away from the core levers of change, bread and circuses. That is exactly what culture wars accomplish in contemporary America. The strategy is elegant in its cruelty. It's emotionally satisfying for the participants. Everyone gets to feel morally righteous, socially engaged, or even heroic. And yet, almost none of this engagement threatens the structural inequalities that shape their lives. Money remains concentrated. Policy remains favorable to elites. Democratic institutions continue to operate, only now as instruments of distraction rather than protection. Public anger is turned inward, towards neighbors and communities, rather than outward, toward the economic power centers that London's Iron Heel would recognize immediately. In other words, the culture war is not a byproduct of political life. It's the engine of control, the mechanism that allows wealth to translate into durable power, without needing coercion or overt dictatorship. The anger, the outrage, the debates over symbols, these are all carefully calibrated distractions, keeping the base motivated while the oligarchs continue to consolidate influence. London imagined this in the early 20th century. He saw the danger of a system where wealth captured government and democracy became performance. What he didn't quite foresee, but Heinlein did decades later, was the role of media, technology, and social identity in amplifying that performance. The culture war in its modern form is the ultimate evolution of London's insight, authoritarianism that thrives not by crushing dissent, but by keeping it endlessly preoccupied. And the result? A society where energy and outrage are abundant, but real political power, the power to change economic structures, to redistribute resources, to challenge entrenched hierarchies, is almost entirely absent from public focus. The culture war doesn't just divide people. It protects the very structures that make such division possible in the first place. Now let's jump forward several decades and look at Robert Heinlein's Friday. This is a very different kind of dystopia than London imagined. But it's part of the same story, an evolution of the Iron Heel concept. In Heinlein's world, the nation-state still exists, on paper. Flags fly, Congress convenes, courts issue rulings. But all of it is largely ceremonial. Real power no longer resides in elected officials or in the government institutions we assume guide public life. Real power resides in multinational corporations, Entities so vast, so wealthy, and so autonomous that they function like governments in all but name. They hire private security forces. They enforce their own rules. They operate above the law, or at least outside the reach of most regulation. Heinlein's vision strips away the pretense of democracy entirely, showing what happens when London's oligarchs complete the capture of the state. The state doesn't collapse violently. It becomes irrelevant. Its offices, its parliaments, its bureaucracies continue to exist, but they exist to facilitate, to legitimize, to administer the priorities of corporate sovereignty, rather than to protect public interests. Elected officials, if they exist at all, are administrators, spokespersons, or intermediaries. Real decisions that affect trade, labor, access to resources, and the very structure of society, those are made elsewhere, in boardrooms, in shareholder meetings, in contracts written by elite lawyers who answer to no electorate. What made Heinlein's dystopia so unnervingly prescient is how recognizable it already feels. You don't need to imagine a far-off future. You can see the echoes of it in our present reality. Private equity firms carve up industries, consolidating power and reshaping markets, like feudal lords deciding which towns flourish and which collapse. Right, Flint? Technology companies operate quasi-sovereign platforms, controlling infrastructure and information flows, deciding what speech is allowed, what commerce is permitted, and even what governments can access. Some corporations now rival nations in size, wealth, and global influence. And in many cases, the U.S. government itself acts more like a subcontractor, a regulator forced to negotiate with these private actors, rather than a sovereign authority dictating terms. The arc Heinlein imagined is clear. Once wealth is concentrated and power is privatized, the institutions of the state, legislatures, courts, bureaucracies, become instruments rather than guardians. They enforce rules created elsewhere, rules that protect property, consolidate advantage, and maintain social order in a way that benefits the elite. This is the logical extension of the iron heel. Once oligarchs capture the levers of state power, the public state no longer is necessary. The mechanisms of democracy become window dressing, a set stage for legitimacy, while the real rulers operate out of sight. We're not fully there yet. Not every government has been replaced by corporate domination. Not every industry is completely privatized. But the silhouette of Heinlein's world is visible on the horizon. You see it in privatized military contractors, in monopolistic tech platforms, in for-profit prison systems, in billionaire-led global initiatives that rival entire nations in scale and influence. You see it in the way economic power dictates international policy, domestic law, and even cultural norms. And the frightening part is how smooth it all appears from the inside. There's no need for jackboots on the street, unless you're in Minneapolis or Portland again. There's no need for a dictator to issue decrees. The system functions because the rules have been rewritten, quietly, legally, and efficiently. Corporate sovereignty doesn't need to overthrow democracy. It just outgrows it. Democracy becomes a formality, a stage performance, a tool for creating consent rather than enforcing accountability. Heinlein's dark mirror shows us what happens when London's iron heel reaches its endpoint. And as we look at the trajectory of power today, the concentration of wealth, the influence of corporations on government, the privatization of infrastructure, even the control of information flows, it's hard not to see the warning written in plain sight. The future Heinlein imagined isn't science fiction anymore. It's a possibility that's creeping closer every day. The structures are forming, the power is consolidating, and unless we recognize it and act, we may wake up one day to a world where the nation-state exists only as a shadow, while the real rulers operate above, around, and beyond it. So what does this all mean when we step back and look at the present? What do these threads, London's Iron Heel, Reagan's capture of the state, the culture wars, Heinlein's corporate sovereignty, actually add up to? The answer is uncomfortable because it exposes a blind spot many on the right either ignore or fail to see. A structural authoritarianism that runs counter to the very language of freedom that the movement continuously invokes. The modern right talks endlessly about liberty, personal responsibility, and the virtues of limited government. But if you look at the actual policies, the trajectory tells a different story. It's not subtle. There's more surveillance, more policing, more restrictions on voting access, more interference in education, and more regulation over personal choices. Decisions about bodies, family, healthcare, and speech. The state that is supposedly small in the eyes of conservatives is actively expanding its reach in ways that directly constrain individual freedom. And here's the key point, or maybe the theme. This isn't accidental. This isn't ideological drift. It isn't a contradiction that can be explained away with hand-waving about cultural anxieties or political realignment. Every restriction, every regulatory creep, every institutional maneuver serves a very specific purpose: the preservation and expansion of elite power. A tightly controlled society is easier to govern when your goal isn't the public good, but the protection of wealth. Public power, labor unions, collective bargaining, civic institutions, regulatory agencies, is weakened, neutralized, or captured. Identities are fragmented, endlessly categorized, and constantly pitted against each other. Meanwhile, citizens expend enormous emotional energy fighting symbolic battles. Which books stay in the libraries? Which pronouns are acceptable? Mine are it and that. Which curriculum dominates the classroom? These fights feel existential to those embroiled in them, but they leave untouched the very structures that concentrate economic and political power at the top. Look closely at the paradox. The right's rhetoric is libertarian: freedom, independence, autonomy. But its architecture is authoritarian: centralized control of surveillance, policing, and social order. And its beneficiaries are oligarchic: a small elite whose wealth and influence shape policy, media, and cultural norms far more than any voter, campaign, or election ever could. London understood the dynamics a century ago. He saw how concentrated economic power could hollow out democracy, how institutions could be repurposed to serve the few at the expense of the many, and how the majority could be kept occupied with ritualized performance of choice, elections, debates, and symbolic conflicts, without ever gaining substantive control. Heinlein extended that version into the future, where corporations replace governments entirely, operating above regulation and asserting quasi-sovereign authority, demonstrating the logical endpoint of this trajectory. We're not fully there yet, but we're living in the transitional phase. The mechanisms are in place. The culture war is fully weaponized. The state is partially captured, partially complicit, and partially irrelevant, depending on the sector. And the public, engaged in constant conflict over symbols, often fails to see that the rules of the game themselves have been rewritten. This blind spot on the right is particularly insidious because it's invisible from the inside. People believe they're fighting for liberty. They vote for candidates who promise freedom. They argue, protest, and organize. All the while, the system that truly consolidates power remains untouched. Its operations abstracted and obscured behind legalese, corporate channels, and media spin. The irony is brutal. The more vocally the rhetoric champions liberty, the more authoritarian the architecture becomes. the more people are convinced they are protecting their freedoms, the less power they actually have over the structural levers of society. And all the while, the wealthy elite quietly expands influence, consolidates wealth, and reshapes democracy in a way that ensures its own perpetuation. This is the blind spot. This is the irony. This is the transitional phase London foresaw and Heinlein dramatized. And if we don't recognize it, we risk mistaking performance for progress, rhetoric for reality, and symbolic conflict for meaningful change. The right's ideological narrative may celebrate independence, but the system they've enabled or allowed to grow ensures dependence on capital, on corporate structures, on institutions that serve the elite rather than the citizenry. And that, ultimately, is the lesson we cannot afford to ignore. When you step back and connect all these threads, the literary warnings of Jack London, the historical pivot of Reagan's America, the cultural manipulation perfected over decades, and Heinlein's speculative extrapolation, you begin to see a pattern. It's not a conspiracy in the traditional sense, not a sudden seizure of power, not a dictator marching down the steps of the Capitol. It's something quieter, slower, far more effective. It's structural. It's systemic. It's the iron heel operating in plain sight. London imagined a world where democracy wasn't overthrown in the night. It was hollowed out from within. Elections continued, newspapers printed, politicians spoke. Yet behind the scenes, economic elites consolidated power, bending institutions to their will. Fast forward 75 years, and Reagan built the scaffolding for the very transformation. Deregulation, tax cuts, union suppression, lobbying networks, media consolidation. These were the mechanisms by which structural advantage was encoded into the system. Robert Heinlein took London's insight one step further. In Friday, the state exists only as a formal shell. Real authority resides in multinational corporations, so wealthy and autonomous that they effectively govern themselves. Boards, shareholders, and executives, not voters, make the decisions that shape society. Corporations even go to war with each other. Heinlein's vision was meant as a dystopian fiction, but as we look around today, the silhouette is unmistakable. Corporate influence rivals national authority in some sectors. Platforms dictate information flow. Private contractors enforce policy. Economic power increasingly shapes laws, elections, and even cultural norms. And here's the irony, the lesson that makes this moment so precarious. People obsess about tyranny as though it requires a dictator. They imagine a Mussolini, a Hitler, a Trump-style figure, seizing the reins and imposing absolute will. But that's not the system we face. The danger doesn't lie in a single visible tyrant. The danger lies in a system where no single tyrant is necessary, because the oligarchy already runs smoothly. Wealth and structural control have become their own engine of governance. The institutions appear functional, even democratic. But the levers of actual power have been quietly captured, calibrated, and aligned with elite interests. To understand the crises of our present moment, the rise of authoritarian tendencies, the collapse of public trust, the endless, pointless, emotionally charged culture wars, we have to stop seeing them as isolated or random. They are not simply the product of bad elections, poor leadership, or social media hysteria. They are symptoms of a long-term deliberate shift from democratic power to plutocratic power. Every cultural skirmish, every legislative compromise, every media frenzy fits into a system designed to keep the public occupied, divided, and largely powerless when it comes to the structures that truly shape their lives. We are living in the shadow of the iron heel. London warned us over a century ago that concentrated wealth could hollow out democracy without ever needing to overthrow it. Heinlein showed us what happens if the process continues unchecked. The state becomes a shell, and the real rulers operate above it, untouched, unaccountable, and insulated from the will of the people. The choices before us are clear, if uncomfortable. Ignoring the structural reality of power, dismissing the culture wars as mere distraction, or assuming that freedom is guaranteed simply because elections exist will not prevent the trajectory from continuing. Recognizing the patterns, naming the mechanisms, and understanding the long arc of wealth and power isn't pessimism, it's preparation. Because if we fail to recognize what the iron heel truly represents, if we fail to address the structural capture of government and society by concentrated wealth, we may wake up one day not in a world ruled by a dictator, but in a world more like Heinlein's Friday, a world where corporations govern quietly, power is invisible yet absolute, and the language of democracy continues as a hollow performance, while the levers of real authority rest entirely in private hands. And that is the warning we cannot afford to ignore.